In the winter of 1891, the German immigrant community of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, whispered about 11-year-old Clara Wentz in hushed, fearful tones. This pale, quiet child could calculate the day of the week for any date in human history within seconds, memorize entire conversations word for word after hearing them just once, and recite the precise number of steps between any two buildings in her neighborhood. What modern science might recognize as an extraordinary neurological condition was to the people of 1891 either a divine blessing or something far more sinister. But when Clara began using her remarkable abilities to reveal buried secrets, predict deadly accidents, and recite intimate details of crimes that supposedly no living person had witnessed, the community's amazement turned to terror. By spring, 3 men would be dead. A family would flee in the night, and Clara Wentz herself would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only a leather journal filled with numbers that no one dared to decode. Before we continue with the chilling story of Clara Wentz and the dark secrets her extraordinary mind uncovered in Pittsburgh's German Quarter, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most haunting historical mysteries every week, and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. These stories happened in communities just like yours, closer to home than you might think. What the residents of Breweryville didn't realize was that Clara's gift would expose a web of lies, betrayal, and murder that had been carefully hidden for nearly a decade, and that her mathematical precision would become their community's most terrifying nightmare. Pittsburgh's German Quarter in 1891 was a bustling enclave of red brick breweries, modest wooden homes, and the constant sound of German voices mixing with English in the crisp Pennsylvania air. The community of nearly 9,000 German immigrants had built their own little Bavaria along the shores of the Allegheny River, complete with beer gardens, traditional bakeries, and the familiar rhythms of old-world life transplanted to American soil. The men worked in the breweries Iron City, Eberhart, and Ober, and the dozens of smaller operations that made Pittsburgh famous, while their wives tended gardens that yielded the same vegetables their grandmothers had grown in the Rhineland. Franz and Liesel Wentz had arrived from Bavaria in 1880 with dreams of prosperity, and their infant daughter, Clara. Franz found steady work as a brewmaster at the Schneider Brewery, a mid-sized operation that supplied beer to the growing city's thirsty population. Liesel took in laundry and mending to supplement their income, her nimble fingers working by candlelight long after Clara had been put to bed in their small but tidy home on Penn Street. The Wentzes were unremarkable in every way except for their daughter. Clara had been born during the harsh Atlantic crossing, 3 weeks premature and so small that the ship's doctor doubted she would survive the journey. But survive she did, though she remained slight and pale with enormous gray eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with unsettling intensity. As a toddler, she rarely cried or demanded attention, content to sit quietly in corners, watching and listening as the adult world unfolded around her. By age 4, Clara's parents began to notice something unusual. She could recite entire conversations she had overheard days earlier, complete with the precise inflections and accents of the speakers. She counted everything: the number of stitches in her mother's embroidery, the steps from their front door to the bakery, the exact time between the brewery whistles that marked the beginning and end of each workday. When Franz taught her basic arithmetic, she absorbed mathematical concepts with frightening speed, solving problems in her head faster than he could work them out on paper. The German community initially viewed Clara's abilities with a mixture of pride and unease. Old Frau Schmidt, who claimed to remember the witch trials in her grandmother's stories, crossed herself whenever Clara's calculating gray eyes fixed on her. But Pastor Heinrich, the stout Bavarian minister who served their small Lutheran parish, declared Clara's gifts to be a blessing from God, a child chosen to demonstrate divine wisdom in their New World community. The winter of 1890 had been particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping so low that the Allegheny River froze solid for the first time in a generation. The brewery workers huddled around coal stoves, their breath visible even indoors, while their wives struggled to keep their families warm and fed through the long, bitter months. It was during this isolated winter that Clara's abilities began to take on a darker character, though no one yet understood what was coming. Clara had developed the habit of sitting by the small window in their kitchen, watching the neighbors go about their daily routines with the same intense focus she applied to mathematical problems. She began to notice patterns, not just in numbers, but in human behavior. Her miller always walked to the brewery by the same route, taking exactly 253 steps, except on Tuesdays when he took a different path that required 290 steps. Frau Klein hung her laundry in a specific sequence, but when her husband worked late at the mill, she changed the order completely. These observations might have been dismissed as the quirks of an unusual child, except that Clara began to vocalize her findings in ways that made the adults increasingly uncomfortable. The transformation from curiosity to dread began on a gray February morning in 1891. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table, methodically eating her breakfast while her mother prepared her father's lunch pail when she suddenly looked up and announced, "Herr Becker will not come home from the brewery today. He will die at exactly 17 minutes past 3 o'clock. Liesel nearly dropped the tin pail she was holding. "Clara, my God, what a terrible thing to say. Why would you think such a thing?" Clara's gray eyes remained fixed on her mother's face with that unsettling intensity. "He has been drinking from the small brown bottle for 21 days. Yesterday, he drank 4 times more than usual. His steps were uneven, 260 instead of his normal 249. When people change their patterns by more than 10%, something significant happens within 72 hours. Herr Becker's pattern changed by 15%. The calculation is simple." Franz, who had been putting on his heavy wool coat, stopped and stared at his daughter. Johann Becker was indeed a drinker, but no more than half the men in the German quarter. The idea that Clara had been counting his steps and tracking his drinking habits was disturbing enough, but her calm mathematical certainty about his death sent a chill through both parents that had nothing to do with the Pennsylvania winter. "You must not say such things, Clara," Franz said firmly. "It's not proper for a child to speak of death." Clara simply nodded and returned to her breakfast, but her parents exchanged worried glances over her bent head. They had grown accustomed to their daughter's unusual observations, but this felt different, darker, and more specific than her typical mathematical pronouncements. At precisely 17 minutes past 3 that afternoon, Johann Becker collapsed in the brewery's malt room. The official cause of death was heart failure, brought on by what Dr. Schneider determined to be chronic alcohol poisoning. The brewery workers who found him noted that he had been acting strangely for weeks, drinking more heavily than usual and showing signs of severe anxiety. But what truly unsettled them was the timing. Clara Wentz's prediction had been accurate to the minute. Word of Clara's grim prophecy spread through the German quarter like smoke from a chimney fire. Some dismissed it as coincidence, but others remembered the pale girl with the calculating eyes and began to wonder what else she might have observed during her silent vigils at the kitchen window. The Wentz family found themselves the subject of whispered conversations and sideways glances when they walked to church or visited the market. Pastor Heinrich, who had previously praised Clara's gifts as divine, now seemed less certain. When Franz approached him after Sunday Mass, seeking guidance about his daughter's disturbing prediction, the minister's jovial demeanor had been replaced by something approaching concern. "Franz, my friend," Pastor Heinrich said, his Bavarian accent thick with worry, "perhaps it would be best if young Clara spent less time watching the neighbors and more time with her prayers. The Lord gives us gifts, yes, but sometimes the devil can twist even the most innocent abilities toward darker purposes." This suggestion troubled Franz deeply. He had always been a practical man, more concerned with the science of brewing than the mysteries of faith. But even he could not dismiss the unsettling accuracy of Clara's prediction. That evening he sat his daughter down for a serious conversation. "Clara, you must tell me the truth. How did you know about Herr Becker?" Clara looked at her father with those enormous gray eyes, her expression as calm and analytical as always. "I watch, I count, I remember." Herr Becker's behavior changed in predictable ways. When someone increases their alcohol consumption by 40% over a 21-day period, while simultaneously reducing their food intake by approximately 25%, cardiac stress becomes inevitable. I calculated the most probable time of failure based on his age, weight, and observed symptoms. Franz felt his blood run cold. His 11-year-old daughter was speaking like a physician or something far more troubling. "But Clara, how could you know all these details about Herr Becker's eating and drinking?" "I observe everything, Papa, every day, every person, every pattern." Clara's voice remained matter-of-fact, but there was something in her eyes that made Franz deeply uncomfortable. "Would you like me to tell you about the other calculations I've made?" Franz quickly shook his head. He did not want to know what else his daughter had calculated about their neighbors' lives and deaths. But as he tucked Clara into bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that his family was standing at the edge of something much darker than a simple mathematical curiosity. The February snow continued to fall outside their small house, muffling the sounds of the German quarter and creating an insulated world where secrets could be hidden and observations could be made without detection. Clara lay quietly in her narrow bed, her mathematical mind processing the day's data and calculating probabilities that number 11-year-old should be able to comprehend, and certainly number 11-year-old should want to know. In the weeks following Johann Becker's death, the atmosphere in Pittsburgh's German quarter shifted like the wind off the Allegheny River. Clara continued her daily observations, but now her parents watched her with growing unease as she sat by the kitchen window, her gray eyes tracking the movements of their neighbors with mechanical precision. The child, who had once been their pride, had become a source of deep, knowing worry. The brewing community was tight-knit by necessity. The men relied on each other for work, their wives for companionship during the long winters, and their children played together in the narrow streets between the red brick buildings. But Clara had never quite fit into this social fabric. While other children played games and told stories, she preferred to sit alone, counting and calculating and watching the world around her with that unsettling intensity. Liesel began to notice that Clara's observations were becoming more detailed and more disturbing. The child would mention casually that Frau Meyer had been meeting secretly with Hebron behind the brewery on Wednesday afternoons for 7 weeks, or that the Schultz family had been burying something in their back garden every Sunday after church. When Liesel asked how Clara could possibly know such things, the girl would simply explain that she had observed the patterns and calculated the probabilities. "People think they are being secret," Clara said one March morning as she methodically buttered her bread. "But they follow patterns just like numbers. Frau Meyer always tells her husband she's visiting her sister on Wednesday afternoons, but she takes 135 steps to Hebron's house instead of 360 steps to her sister's. The Schultzes bury objects wrapped in cloth exactly 75 centimeters apart in a grid pattern. They believe no one is watching, but I am always watching." Franz had heard enough. That evening, after Clara was asleep, he spoke seriously with his wife about their daughter's increasingly troubling behavior. "Liesel, this cannot continue. Clara is becoming unnatural. Children should not observe such things, and they certainly should not speak of them so coldly." Liesel nodded, her hands trembling as she mended one of Franz's work shirts. "I'm frightened, Franz. Not of Clara, but of what people will think. Already the neighbors look at us strangely. Frau Schmidt crossed the street yesterday when she saw me coming. And Pastor Heinrich, he has not visited us since Johann's death." Their fears proved justified when 3 days later, Clara made another of her mathematical announcements. She was helping her mother prepare dinner when she suddenly stopped peeling potatoes and looked up with that familiar calculating expression. "Frau Meyer will be discovered tomorrow at 10 in the morning. Her husband will find her with Hebron in the brewery office. There will be violence." Liesel dropped her paring knife. "Clara, 9, you must not say such things." But Clara continued with the same mathematical certainty she applied to her arithmetic lessons. "Frau Meyer has been arriving at the brewery 8 minutes earlier each week for 7 weeks. Hebron has been staying 35 minutes later each day. Tomorrow, Herr Meyer will return from his delivery route 50 minutes early because his horse is developing lameness in her right front leg. I have observed her gait deteriorating for 13 days. The convergence of these 3 variables makes discovery inevitable." Franz, who had been listening from the doorway, felt his chest tighten with dread. His daughter was not just observing their neighbors, she was predicting their futures with terrifying accuracy. "Clara, how do you know about Herr Meyer's horse?" "I count her steps when she passes our house. On March 1st, she favored her left leg 55% of the time. Today, it was 70%. Tomorrow, the lameness will be severe enough to slow the delivery route by 50 minutes, causing Herr Meyer to return early." The next day unfolded exactly as Clara had calculated. Wilhelm Meyer discovered his wife Anna in a compromising position with brewery owner Joseph Braun. The confrontation that followed left Braun with a broken nose and 4 cracked ribs, while Anna was beaten so severely that Dr. Schneider had to be summoned. The scandal rocked the tight-knit German community. But what disturbed people even more was the growing realization that little Clara, Wentz had somehow predicted the entire sequence of events. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The pale girl with the mathematical mind had not only predicted Johann Becker's death, but had also foreseen the Meyer-Braun scandal with unsettling precision. People began to whisper about the strange child who sat at her window, watching and calculating, and somehow knowing things that no child should know. The Wentz family found themselves increasingly isolated. Former friends avoided them at church. Children were forbidden from playing near their house, and even the shopkeepers in the German quarter began to treat them with barely concealed suspicion. Franz's position at the brewery became tenuous. His fellow workers viewed him with unease, and Joseph Braun, still recovering from his beating, made it clear that the Wentz family was no longer welcome at company social events. But Clara seemed oblivious to the growing hostility around her. She continued her daily observations, her mathematical mind processing data and calculating probabilities with mechanical precision. She began keeping a leather journal, filling its pages with numbers, dates, and observations that her parents dared not read. The sight of their 11-year-old daughter bent over her calculations, writing in neat columns of figures, filled them with a dread they could not name. As winter gave way to spring, the isolation deepened. The German quarter that had once felt like home now seemed hostile and threatening. Franz began to consider the unthinkable, leaving Pittsburgh, abandoning the life they had built, and starting over somewhere far from the whispers and the fear and the terrible accuracy of their daughter's predictions. But Clara was not finished with her calculations. The worst was yet to come, and her mathematical mind had already begun processing the data that would lead to the darkest secrets of all. As April arrived in Pittsburgh, bringing with it the first tentative warmth after the brutal winter, Clara's journal grew thicker with her precise notations. The leather-bound book had become her constant companion, and she filled its pages with increasingly complex calculations that went far beyond simple mathematics. Her parents caught glimpses of charts tracking human behavior patterns, tables of numerical sequences they couldn't understand, and detailed maps of the German quarter marked with symbols and measurements. The community's fear of Clara had begun to manifest in more concrete ways. Children were forbidden from walking past the Wentz house. Shopkeepers served the family quickly and without conversation, and even Pastor Heinrich had begun limiting his interactions with them to formal church services. But Clara's isolation only seemed to sharpen her observational skills, as if the removal of normal social distractions allowed her unusual mind to focus more intently on the mathematical patterns she perceived in human behavior. Dr. George Schneider, the community's physician, had grown increasingly curious about Clara's abilities. Unlike the superstitious whispers of the neighbors, Dr. Schneider approached the situation with scientific interest. He had studied medicine in Berlin before immigrating to America and had encountered cases of unusual mental capabilities in his practice. When Franz Wentz approached him privately, seeking medical advice about his daughter's condition, Dr. Schneider agreed to examine Clara. The examination took place on a rainy Thursday morning in Dr. Schneider's office above the pharmacy on Main Street. Clara submitted to the doctor's questions and tests with the same mathematical precision she applied to everything else, answering each inquiry with detailed accuracy, while her gray eyes remained fixed on some invisible calculation. "Clara," Dr. Schneider said in his accented English, "your father tells me you can predict when certain events will happen. Can you explain to me how you do this?" Clara looked at the doctor with that unsettling intensity. "I observe patterns and calculate probabilities based on established behavioral data. People believe their actions are random, but they follow mathematical sequences. When I have sufficient data points, I can predict future behavior with high accuracy." Dr. Schneider leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Can you give me an example?" Clara consulted her journal, flipping through pages of neat numerical notations. "Frau Schmidt believes she is keeping a secret, but her pattern is quite obvious. Every Monday and Thursday for 9 weeks, she has walked to the church at exactly 3:30 in the afternoon. But instead of entering for prayer, she continues to the rectory and remains for precisely 45 minutes. Pastor Heinrich's pattern has also changed. He has been purchasing extra candles and wine, and his evening prayers have extended by an average of 19 minutes on Mondays and Thursdays. The correlation is statistically significant." Dr. Schneider felt his breath catch. The implications of what Clara was suggesting about the minister and the widow were scandalous enough, but the methodical way she had documented her observations was deeply troubling. "Clara, how long have you been watching people in this way?" "Always," Clara replied simply. "Since I was very small, but I only began making calculations when I learned mathematics." The patterns became clearer then. After the examination, Dr. Schneider spoke privately with Franz and Liesel Wentz. His medical training told him that Clara's condition was neurological rather than supernatural, but he had no framework for understanding what he had observed. "Your daughter's mind works differently than other children's," he explained. "She processes information in ways that seem almost mechanical. In my opinion, this is a medical condition, not the other things people are saying. But even Dr. Schneider's scientific perspective couldn't diminish the growing dread that surrounded Clara's predictions. 2 days after his examination, Clara made another of her calculated announcements. There will be a fire at the Muller house on Sunday evening. It will start at 9:15 and spread to 2 adjacent buildings before the volunteer fire brigade can respond. Her Muller will not survive. Franz felt the familiar chill that accompanied his daughter's predictions. Clara, you must not say such things. How could you possibly know about a fire? Clara consulted her journal. Her Muller has been drinking lamp oil mixed with whiskey for 15 days. I observed him purchasing both items in quantities that exceed normal household use. His wife left for Cincinnati to visit her sister yesterday, which follows the pattern of wives leaving before significant domestic incidents occur. The chimney on their house has structural damage that I calculated based on the angle of smoke emission and the pattern of soot deposits. The probability of fire is 95%. Liesel began to weep softly. The clinical way Clara discussed potential tragedy, as if human suffering were simply another mathematical problem to be solved, frightened her more than any supernatural explanation would have. This was her child, but she no longer recognized the cold precision in Clara's voice or the mechanical way she processed human pain. Franz made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided to warn Friedrich Muller about Clara's prediction, hoping that preventive action might save a life and perhaps demonstrate that his daughter's calculations could be used for good rather than simply predicting disaster. He found Muller at the brewery Saturday evening, stumbling drunken, reeking of the lamp oil Clara had mentioned. Franz's warning was met with belligerent laughter and crude jokes about the devil child who thinks she knows everything. But something in Franz's desperation must have penetrated Muller's alcoholic haze, because he promised to be extra careful with the lamps. Sunday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth and a dry wind from the west. At exactly 9:15, flames erupted from the Muller house. The fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming not just the original building, but 2 adjacent homes before the volunteer fire brigade could mount an effective response. Friedrich Muller's body was found in his kitchen, where he had apparently fallen while trying to extinguish flames that had spread far beyond his ability to control. The accuracy of Clara's prediction down to the exact minute sent shockwaves through the German quarter. Franz's attempt to warn Muller had been witnessed by several brewery workers, and word spread quickly that Clara had predicted not just the fire, but its precise timing and consequences. The community's unease transformed into open fear, and the Wentz family found themselves completely ostracized. But for Clara, the fire was simply another data point to be recorded in her journal. She noted the correlation between her prediction and the actual event, made adjustments to her calculations based on the observed variables, and began processing new patterns with the same mechanical precision that had made her prediction possible in the first place. The worst part was that she was not finished calculating. The days following the Muller fire transformed the German quarter into a place of whispered fears and sideways glances. Clara's prediction had been too precise, too detailed, and too accurate to be dismissed as coincidence. 2 families, the Weber and the Groh families, had lost their homes in the blaze, and the community was struggling to house the displaced families while trying to process the unsettling reality of Clara's mathematical prophecies. Franz found his position at the brewery had become untenable. His fellow workers avoided him. Conversation stopped when he entered a room, and Joseph Braun, still bearing the marks of Wilhelm Meyer's attack, made it clear that the Wentz family's presence was no longer welcome in any brewery social functions. The mathematical precision of Clara's predictions had transformed their daughter from a curiosity into something the community feared to name. Clara herself seemed unaware of the growing hostility around her. She continued her daily observations, filling page after page of her leather journal with calculations that grew increasingly complex and disturbing. She had begun creating what appeared to be probability matrices, tracking multiple variables simultaneously and generating predictions that extended weeks into the future. Liesel found herself afraid to look at her daughter's journal, terrified of what calculations Clara might be making about their own family or neighbors. The child who had once been her greatest joy had become a source of constant anxiety. Clara's matter-of-fact discussions of human tragedy, her clinical observations about people's most private behaviors, and her mechanical processing of information that should have evoked emotional responses, all contributed to a growing sense that something fundamental had been lost or damaged in her daughter's mind. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late April. Clara was sitting at her usual place by the kitchen window, watching the street activity with her characteristic intensity, when she suddenly looked up at her mother with those calculating gray eyes. "Mama, there is something wrong with the pattern today." Liesel, who was preparing bread for baking, felt her hands begin to tremble. "What do you mean, Clara?" Clara consulted her journal, flipping through pages of numerical notations with practiced efficiency. "Every Tuesday for 12 weeks, Frau Schmidt has walked to the rectory at exactly 3:30. But today, she left her house at 2:55 and walked toward the river instead. Her behavior indicates significant distress. Her step length decreased by 15%, and her breathing pattern was irregular. This suggests she is planning something final." The clinical way Clara discussed Frau Schmidt's apparent suicidal intentions filled Liesel with horror. "Clara, you must not speak of such things. Frau Schmidt is a good woman. She would never." "The mathematical probability is 89%, Clara interrupted with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. "People who dramatically alter established behavioral patterns while displaying physical signs of distress typically execute irreversible decisions within 4 hours of the pattern change. Frau Schmidt's pattern changed 35 minutes ago." Liesel felt the world tilting around her. The realization that her 11-year-old daughter was calmly predicting a neighbor's suicide with mathematical precision was more than she could bear. She dropped her bread dough and ran to find Franz, who was in their small garden behind the house, trying to find some normalcy in the simple act of preparing soil for spring planting. "Franz, you must come quickly. Clara says Frau Schmidt is going to harm herself. We must do something." Franz looked at his wife's terrified face and felt the familiar dread that had become their constant companion. They found Clara still sitting by the window, making additional notations in her journal, as if recording a scientific observation rather than predicting a human tragedy. "Clara, tell me exactly what you observed about Frau Schmidt." Clara looked up from her calculations. She deviated from her established Tuesday pattern by 35 minutes. Her physical indicators suggested severe emotional distress. Based on historical data about behavioral pattern disruption, the probability of self-harm is 89%, with peak likelihood occurring between 6 and 8 this evening. Franz made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He left the house immediately and went searching for Margaret Schmidt, following the route toward the river that Clara had indicated. He found the elderly widow standing on the dock where the fishing boats tied up, staring into the dark water with an expression of profound despair. "Frau Schmidt," Franz called softly, approaching carefully so as not to startle her. "Are you all right?" The elderly woman turned toward him, her eyes red with tears. "Franz, what are you doing here?" I was concerned about you. You seem troubled lately." Frau Schmidt's face crumpled. "I cannot bear it anymore, Franz. The shame, the whispers, the knowledge that everyone knows about my weakness. Pastor Heinrich says it is sin, but I cannot help what I feel for him. Better to end it than to live with this disgrace." Franz realized with growing horror that Clara's observations about Frau Schmidt and Pastor Heinrich had been accurate, and that the elderly woman was indeed contemplating suicide rather than face the scandal. He spent the next 2 hours talking Margaret Schmidt away from the river, convincing her that shame was not worth dying for, and that the community's judgment would eventually fade. When he returned home that evening, he found Clara making final notations in her journal. Frau Schmidt did not follow through with her plan, she observed clinically. The intervention changed the probability calculation. I will need to adjust my variables for future predictions involving third-party interference. Franz stared at his daughter in disbelief. Clara had somehow observed and calculated a suicide attempt that had not yet occurred. And now she was treating his intervention as simply another data point to be incorporated into her mathematical models. The realization that his 11-year-old daughter was not just predicting tragic events, but studying humans suffering with scientific detachment, filled him with a horror he could not name. That night, as Clara slept peacefully in her narrow bed, Franz and Liesel made a decision that would change their lives forever. They could not continue living in Pittsburgh. Clara's abilities, whatever they were, had made their life in the German quarter impossible. But more troubling was the growing realization that their daughter was not just observing and calculating human behavior, but seemed to be losing touch with the emotional reality of the tragedies she predicted. They began making quiet plans to leave Pennsylvania, to find someplace where Clara could live without being feared, and where her unusual mind might find a different outlet. But Clara was not finished with her calculations, and the most disturbing revelations were yet to come. As Franz lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of the German quarter settling into sleep, he could not shake the feeling that his daughter's mathematical mind had uncovered secrets that went far deeper than adultery and suicide attempts. The precision of her observations, the clinical way she discussed human tragedy, and the growing complexity of her calculations, all suggested that Clara had been watching and recording far more than anyone realized. And the most terrifying part was that she was still calculating. The revelation that would expose the darkest secret of Pittsburgh's German quarter came on the first day of May 1891. Clara had been making increasingly complex calculations in her journal, creating elaborate charts that tracked the movements and behaviors of virtually every adult in their community. Her parents had begun packing their belongings in preparation for leaving Pennsylvania, hoping to escape before Clara's next prediction could destroy more lives. But that morning, as spring sunlight streamed through their kitchen window, Clara made an announcement that would shake the very foundations of their community. "Papa," she said, looking up from her journal with those calculating gray eyes, "I need to show you something important. My calculations have revealed a pattern that explains everything." Franz, who had been dreading this moment for weeks, reluctantly sat down across from his daughter. Clara opened her journal to a section filled with detailed charts, maps, and numerical sequences that looked more like the work of a trained investigator than an 11-year-old child. "For 28 months, I have been observing and recording the behavior patterns of 45 adults in our community." Clara began with her characteristic clinical precision. "Initially, I believed the patterns were random variations. But when I analyzed the data systematically, I discovered correlations that indicate organized criminal activity." Franz felt his blood run cold. "Clara, what are you saying?" Clara consulted her charts with the methodical precision of a mathematics professor. 8 men in our community have been meeting secretly every Thursday at midnight in the basement of Braun's brewery. I calculated their movement patterns based on observed deviations from normal behavior, timing inconsistencies in their stated activities, and physical evidence of their gatherings. She pointed to a detailed map of the German quarter marked with symbols and measurements. "Herr Schmidt tells his wife he works late on Thursday nights, but he leaves the mill at exactly the same time as the other 7 men and walks to the brewery, using a route that avoids the main streets. The pattern has been consistent for 28 months, with only 4 exceptions that correlated with illness or family emergencies." Franz stared at the map, recognizing the names Clara had marked: Wilhelm Meyer, Joseph Braun's brother; Karl Schultz, Friedrich Muller's cousin; Gustav Schmidt, Paul Wolf, Heinrich Klein, and Thomas Gruber. "Clara, how could you possibly know about secret meetings?" "I observe everything, Papa, every night, every movement, every deviation from established patterns." Clara turned to another page filled with numerical calculations. "But the meetings are not the most significant discovery. My calculations indicate these 8 men have been involved in systematic theft from the brewery operations, with estimated losses of approximately $55,000 over 28 months. Franz's hands began to tremble. The sum Clara mentioned represented more money than most families in the German quarter would see in a lifetime. "How could you calculate such a thing?" Clara's explanation was delivered with the same mathematical precision she applied to all her observations. "I noticed discrepancies between the reported beer production figures and the actual output I calculated based on observed deliveries, ingredients purchased, and waste disposal patterns. The difference indicated systematic theft, but I needed to identify the perpetrators." She pointed to detailed charts tracking the behavior patterns of the 8 men. These individuals all showed consistent patterns of increased spending that did not correlate with their reported incomes. Herr Meyer purchased new furniture, worth approximately $350. Herr Schmidt sent money to relatives in Germany. I observed him at the post office 15 times with packages too large for normal correspondence. The pattern was consistent across all 8 men. Franz realized he was looking at evidence of a criminal conspiracy that his 11-year-old daughter had uncovered through her obsessive observations and mathematical analysis. But Clara was not finished with her revelations. The theft operation required inside knowledge of brewery security and access to the financial records, Clara continued. My calculations indicated the involvement of someone in management. The patterns pointed to Joseph Braun himself as the organizer of the theft ring. The final piece of Clara's revelation hit Franz like a physical blow. Joseph Braun, the brewery owner who had been gradually freezing them out of the community, was allegedly the mastermind of a major theft operation involving 8 men from their neighborhood. The precision of Clara's analysis, the mathematical certainty of her conclusions, and the detailed evidence she had compiled through months of observation, all pointed to a truth that was both incredible and terrifying. "Clara, these are very serious accusations. Are you certain of your calculations?" Clara consulted her journal one final time. "The mathematical probability is 98%. But Papa, there is something else, something that explains why her brawn has been trying to isolate our family from the community." Franz felt his chest tighten with dread. "What do you mean?" "Her brawn knows that I observe everything. He has been watching me watch him. For weeks ago, he approached our house 3 times at night and stood outside for 20 minutes each time, as if calculating whether I might have discovered his secret. His behavior indicates he suspects I know about the theft operation." The realization that Clara's mathematical abilities had not only uncovered a criminal conspiracy, but had also made her a target, filled Franz with a terror he had never experienced. His daughter's obsessive observations and calculating mind had revealed secrets that powerful men would kill to protect. Clara closed her journal and looked at her father with those unsettling gray eyes. "Papa, my calculations indicate that we are in significant danger. Her brawn and the others cannot allow me to continue making observations. The mathematical probability of them taking action against our family is 88%, with peak likelihood occurring within the next 72 hours. Franz understood that Clara's final prediction was not about fire or suicide or adultery, but about their own family's survival. Her mathematical mind had uncovered a truth that made their continued existence in Pittsburgh impossible, and the men she had exposed would not hesitate to eliminate the one witness who could destroy them all. That evening, Franz made a decision that would save his family's life. Using the detailed evidence Clara had compiled in her journal, he approached Dr. Schneider under cover of darkness and shared Clara's discoveries. The physician, who had already been disturbed by Clara's unusual abilities, was stunned by the mathematical precision of her criminal investigation. "Franz, if what Clara has calculated is true, we are looking at the largest theft operation in Pittsburgh's history," Dr. Schneider whispered as he examined the journal by lamplight in his office. "But more importantly, if Braun suspects that Clara knows, your family is in mortal danger." Dr. Schneider agreed to help them escape Pittsburgh immediately. Using his medical connections, he arranged for Franz to receive an emergency job offer at a brewery in distant Ohio, providing cover for their sudden departure. They would leave that very night before Clara's 72-hour prediction could come to pass. As the Wentz family loaded their few belongings into Dr. Schneider's wagon under cover of darkness, Clara made one final observation that would haunt Franz for the rest of his life. "Papa, in approximately 7 months, the theft operation will be discovered through other means. Her brawn will face justice, but 3 of the 8 men will not survive the investigation. The mathematical probabilities are quite clear." Franz shuddered as he lifted his daughter into the wagon. Even as they fled for their lives, Clara was calculating the future consequences of the conspiracy she had uncovered. Her prediction would prove accurate in every detail. By winter, a federal investigation would expose the theft ring. Joseph Braun would be arrested and convicted, and 3 of his accomplices would die under suspicious circumstances that were never fully explained. But on that dark May night in 1891, as their wagon rolled through the sleeping streets of Pittsburgh's German Quarter, Franz could only think about how his daughter's extraordinary mathematical mind had both saved their lives and destroyed the only home they had ever known in America. The Wentz family vanished from Pittsburgh in the early hours of May 2, 1891, leaving behind only whispered stories and unanswered questions. Dr. Schneider reported that they had received an emergency family summons back to Bavaria, but the few people who bothered to ask noted that no ship passenger records could be found to confirm their departure from America. What the residents of the German Quarter never learned was that Franz, Liesel, and Clara Wentz had indeed traveled to Ohio, where Franz found work at a small brewery in the town of Canton. Dr. Schneider had sworn to keep their location secret, understanding that Clara's mathematical abilities would always make her a target for those who feared exposure of their secrets. In Canton, the Wentz family attempted to build a new life far from the whispers and fears that had driven them from Pittsburgh. Franz found the brewery work familiar and satisfying, while Liesel slowly began to rebuild the domestic routines that had been shattered by Clara's disturbing predictions. But Clara herself remained unchanged. Her mathematical mind continued to observe, calculate, and record human behavior patterns with the same mechanical precision that had made her both famous and feared. Dr. Schneider maintained correspondence with the family for several months, reporting that Clara had begun working with a mathematics professor at a nearby college who was fascinated by her unusual abilities. The professor, a German immigrant named Dr. Werner Voigt, approached Clara's condition from a scientific rather than supernatural perspective, helping her understand and channel her observational skills in ways that might prove beneficial rather than destructive. But the most significant revelation came in December of 1891, when Drive Schneider received a letter from Franz containing Clara's final prediction about the Pittsburgh theft operation. As she had calculated with mathematical precision, federal investigators had indeed uncovered Joseph Braun's conspiracy. Braun was arrested and convicted of embezzling over $60,000 from multiple brewery operations. Wilhelm Meyer, who had been Braun's primary accomplice, was found dead in his home under circumstances that were ruled a suicide, but which many suspected were something far more sinister. Gustav Schmidt and Heinrich Klein also died within weeks of the investigation's conclusion, Schmidt in what appeared to be a drunken accident, and Klein from what Dr. Schneider diagnosed as a sudden heart attack that bore suspicious similarities to the symptoms of certain poisons. Clara's mathematical analysis of the criminal conspiracy had been accurate in every detail, including her prediction that not all of the conspirators would survive the eventual discovery of their crimes. The precision of her calculations, even from hundreds of miles away and months in advance, confirmed what Franz had come to understand about his daughter's extraordinary and terrifying abilities. The German quarter of Pittsburgh slowly recovered from the scandal and tragedy of 1891. The brewery theft investigation brought unwelcome attention from federal authorities, but it also exposed a level of corruption that had been quietly damaging the community for years. New families moved into the houses left empty by death and departure, and the tight-knit community gradually rebuilt itself around more honest foundations. But the story of Clara Wentz, the pale girl with the calculating gray eyes, who could predict death and expose secrets through mathematical observation, became part of the neighborhood's whispered folklore. Parents used her story to warn their children about the dangers of knowing too much, while adults quietly wondered what other secrets might be hiding behind the ordinary facades of their neighbors' lives. Pastor Heinrich, who had initially blessed Clara's abilities as divine gifts, later confessed to Dr. Schneider that the girl's mathematical predictions had shaken his faith in ways he could not explain. The minister had begun to question whether some knowledge was too dangerous for human minds to possess, and whether Clara's condition represented a blessing or a curse that had been visited upon their community. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Pittsburgh's German quarter intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the most disturbing historical cases America has to offer. Dr. Schneider's final letter to the Wentz family was written in the spring of 1892, nearly a year after their departure from Pittsburgh. In it, he reported that the German quarter had largely returned to normal, but that Clara's story continued to circulate in whispered conversations among the older residents. He also shared a disturbing development that had emerged during the federal investigation of the brewery theft. Government investigators had discovered that Clara's journal, which Franz had left with Dr. Schneider as evidence, contained mathematical calculations that extended far beyond the immediate criminal conspiracy. Clara had apparently been tracking and analyzing behavioral patterns throughout the entire German immigrant community, creating detailed profiles of dozens of families and predicting future events with remarkable accuracy. The federal investigators, trained in criminal analysis, were both impressed and disturbed by the sophistication of Clara's observational methods. Your daughter's mind works in ways that professional investigators might envy, Dr. Schneider wrote, but I confess that I am grateful she is far from Pittsburgh. The precision of her observations and the mathematical certainty of her predictions represent a kind of knowledge that I fear is too dangerous for any community to possess. The final mention of Clara Wentz in any historical record comes from a brief notation in the Canton College Mathematics Department records from 1893. Professor Werner Voigt reported that his special student had demonstrated unprecedented abilities in statistical analysis and behavioral prediction, but that her family had decided to relocate once again for personal reasons. After that entry, Clara Wentz disappeared from history as completely as she had vanished from Pittsburgh on that dark night in May of 1891. What happened to the girl, who could calculate human behavior with mathematical precision, remains unknown. Some researchers have theorized that families like the Wentzes, possessing children with unusual abilities, deliberately maintain their anonymity to protect themselves from both scientific exploitation and community persecution. Clara's story represents one of the few documented cases where such abilities were recorded in sufficient detail to understand their scope and implications. This mystery shows us that the human mind remains one of our greatest enigmas, capable of developing extraordinary abilities that challenge our understanding of intelligence, observation, and prediction. In 1891, Clara Wentz's mathematical approach to human behavior was seen as either divine or demonic. But modern science recognizes that conditions like savant syndrome, autism spectrum disorders, and hyperthymesia can indeed create minds that process information in ways that seem almost supernatural to those who don't understand the neurological mechanisms involved. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think Clara's abilities extended even further than what we discovered? Leave your comment below, and let us know if you've ever encountered someone with similar extraordinary mental abilities. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. These historical cases remind us that the most frightening truths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right mind to calculate their terrible secrets. The case of Clara Wentz demonstrates that sometimes the most terrifying discoveries come not from supernatural forces, but from the relentless application of mathematical logic to human behavior. In a world where we believe our secrets are safe, the existence of minds capable of such precise observation and calculation reminds us that privacy may be nothing more than an illusion, and that the patterns we think we hide may be visible to those who know how to look and how to count.